My dearest brothers and sisters, this is Tunia speaking. I love you so very much. Most people on earth currently have a very short lifespan. Have you noticed how people tend to become older and weaker just as they are all the age where people more or less have figured things out and have gotten some wisdom and stability? Because of your current short lifespans, it is understandable that when Earth people look at politics, they often look at the short term. However, as someone who was blessed with a longer lifespan, I think most of your societies have one huge structural flaw that many people don't sufficiently appreciate. This flaw is, if you let families snowball their wealth, then at your current level of consciousness they will eventually corrupt their society. We see this in the USA, and we saw this in, for example, ancient Rome. To be clear, the problem isn't people who started out middle class and who then started a business and eventually became rich. The problem also isn't a family who passes his farm and his house on to his son. Instead, the problem arises when families become so rich that children born into that family never had to do a day of normal work in their life. If a child is born into wealth and then after their education they go directly into some kind of overseer or vice president or other elevated position, then that is a problem. Why is that a problem? Well, because it creates separation consciousness in those rich and powerful people, which contributes to the stereotypes that rich people are evil and that power corrupts. After all, imagine that you know that you are rich just by birth, and that you will never experience poverty even if you become ill for a long time. Imagine being granted the position of vice president directly after your education, and you have never had to do a day of normal work in your life. And also, of course, you are aware that many people have to work very hard just to pay rent, and every day hard-working people die because they can't afford medical care. Well, logically, you can then conclude two things. One conclusion is that you and your family are benefiting from enormous privilege and that you are sort of morally obligated to sell most of your luxury cars and give that money to the poor. And also, the rest of your family, who are happily flying around in private jets and who have their own yachts, are very callous and uncaring people. Of course, this is a very psychologically uncomfortable conclusion. It leads you towards a path that is much less comfortable and financially secure. It also instantly puts you at odds with the rest of your family. So this conclusion isn't the one that most people draw in this situation. Instead, people draw the other conclusion, which is, our family is wealthier because we're simply better people than the poor's. We're just better people. It's a natural, self-justifying conclusion that people draw in order to be psychologically at ease, which is a human need. So as you can see, families snowballing their wealth leads to big inheritances, which leads to those powerful people usually developing separation consciousness. I am not saying that every rich family is evil, but I am saying that some rich families who snowball their wealth will eventually turn evil with disastrous consequences. Frankly, it would be naive to assume that there will never be any family with snowballed wealth that will ever turn evil. You can't rely on all families with snowballed wealth to stay virtuous forever. And when some of those families do turn evil, they can easily corrupt the entire system as you are currently seeing. To be sure, different families develop separation consciousness to different degrees. Some of those families genuinely want to help. However, because they are so out of touch, that might look like billionaires flying somewhere on their private jet in order to tell the poor to stop driving gas cars in order to reduce their carbon emissions. or they lobby to open up the border while living in a gated community themselves, or they're higher up gray hats and they decide that they shouldn't ever fully inform or fully empower the people because the people can't be trusted. Or they might have separation consciousness to a higher degree and they might offshore jobs and bribe politicians and rig the system for their own benefit. And sure, some families are nice and don't do that, but you can't rely on everyone being nice forever, and thus the system becomes corrupted. And in extreme cases, these families can develop separation consciousness to such a degree that they literally want to depopulate the so-called useless eaters, as is currently true on Earth with the dark controllers. And that's why letting families snowball their wealth in an uncontrolled way is a bad idea. For very understandable psychological reasons, it often leads to people born into those families to develop separation consciousness. And rich, well-connected people with separation consciousness and plenty of time on their hands really can corrupt the entire system. After all, why wouldn't they? I mean, have you seen the rates of return on bribing a politician? If you have separation consciousness, it would be financially irresponsible not to bribe politicians. Similarly, rigging the system for your own benefit is just a smart investment. It would be irrational not to do so. Now, the right points to the state as being the problem, and sure, to an extent it is, but also to an extent the corrupt state is the symptom, with the disease being families who snowballed their wealth so much that they are actively working to corrupt the system. Yes, the corrupt use the state as a tool, but the state also keeps some amount of corruption and abuse from happening. It's just hard to notice things that don't happen. Yet we also know that those African countries with practically zero government aren't exactly beacons of economic growth. Let's imagine that the U.S. doesn't tackle rich families with snowballed wealth, and also magically its national debt disappears and it has the libertarian idea of a small, non-corrupt government. Well, then the rich would automate away lots of jobs via AI and robots, and a few rich families would end up having a quasi-monopoly there. The rich would buy all the land and artificially restrict the supply of food and housing so much that average people would be reduced to debt slavery. Any time someone had a medical condition, that would also put them into debt slavery for the rest of their lives. And note that all of this would be legal in libertarian land. Moreover, the rich would just immediately start enlarging and corrupting the government and courts once more. You can't stop that via legislation because corrupt legislators can just legislate around or repeal any anti-corruption laws. And if you want to argue that a revolution by the people would stop it, well, in libertarian land, the rich would buy police chiefs too, because the very rich would put such a financial strain on everyone, people would be even easier to bribe than they are now. So we can see that while shrinking the government and making it less corrupt are good steps, they are not sufficient. The snowballing of wealth in rich families has to be addressed too. Now the right sometimes claims that 1950 or 1960 was the golden age, and that if only the government got out of the way, the U.S. would encounter another golden age and families would be able to live off one income again. One problem with that logic is that the U.S. is a relatively new country, and in 1950, rich families hadn't had that much time to snowball their wealth yet. However, in 2024, this snowballing is much more severe, which means that if today you shrink down the government, you won't get the golden age that some right-wingers imagine. For example, if the government gets out of the way, then you still have the situation that the U.S. healthcare and military industries are profit-driven and not purpose-driven. Those industries produce horrible outcomes for the amount of money they take in. Because certain families have snowballed their wealth so much, they have made the healthcare system predatory. If you get the government out of the way, the medical industry can still charge ludicrous prices for life-saving medication. Hence, just shrinking the government isn't sufficient. So, frankly, from my perspective, the political right will have to embrace some way to stop families from snowballing their wealth in an uncontrolled way. Otherwise, I don't think their ideology fully works in the long term. One possible solution is inheritance taxes on specifically very large inheritances. It's fine to not tax medium-sized inheritances at all, and also make sure there are no loopholes there. Hopefully, the right can embrace the idea that it's not fair or efficient or good for society if some people inherit so much wealth that they never have to do a normal day's work in their life. The corporate right isn't doing anything against families snowballing their wealth. Trump also wasn't in favor of inheritance taxes. However, Trump tried to mitigate the damage that rich families were doing by trying to stop people from offshoring jobs and by putting tariffs on goods from overseas. Ultimately, though, I think this fights the symptom and not the problem itself, and I think this isn't enough. The European model is that rich people are largely allowed to snowball their wealth. However, through taxation and social programs, attempts are made to guarantee decent lives for European citizens. This is, again, fighting the symptom and not the problem itself. And indeed, Europe is declining. Consider the following. Back when the U.S. was a somewhat new country and families hadn't had much time to snowball their wealth, the U.S. was growing rapidly. As families have more and more time to snowball their wealth, the U.S. is declining more and more. Who are the current rising powers? Russia and China. Did something happen somewhat recently in those countries that would stop families from snowballing their wealth? Well, yes. Both countries were communist within living memory. Communism certainly stops families from snowballing their wealth. Russia isn't communist anymore, and China isn't fully communist anymore. Chinese individuals can own means of production, but communism did reset the timer on the how long have families been able to snowball their wealth clock. Moreover, Putin went to war with the oligarchs, and China is cracking down on corruption, thus further dampening the ability of rich families to snowball their wealth. Hence, Russia and China are rising and the West is declining. I'm not saying that the U.S. needs a violent communist revolution or needs an extrajudicial crackdown on rich people. I'm just saying that the U.S. needs some way of stopping rich families from snowballing their wealth. Here I agree with the left that, for example, inheritance taxes on exclusively very large inheritances would be a good thing, but also actually applying existing laws to rich families and actually arresting known traitors would help us as well. And yes, shrinking the government and stopping government corruption would help too, but by itself that's not enough. Another interesting option is having a land value tax instead of a property tax, or having a land value tax instead of some other tax. That way, homeowners don't pay more than they do now. However, the very rich, who own huge amounts of land, will be nudged to either start using their land productively or to sell it to someone who will. For this reason, economists really like this tax. Land value taxes are taxes on the land itself without regard for the buildings on it. So with property taxes, you are taxed more if you build a house or improve an existing house, whereas land value taxes don't go up if you build or improve houses on land that you own. That is why land value taxes have been called the perfect tax. And again, you can replace an existing tax with it. It doesn't necessarily need to be implemented on top of all the other taxes. I get that people on the right really don't like taxes, but what I'm suggesting here are things that won't increase the tax burden on the 99% at all. If you want to be ideological about it, well, the freedom for families to snowball their wealth eventually destroys all other freedoms, and you are seeing right now in the West. So in summary, if you let rich families snowball their wealth, then there is a tendency in some of those families to develop separation consciousness. This leads to some of those families to corrupt, consume the entire system over time. A large part of the problems that we see in the West today can be traced back to that. In Pleiadian society, we don't allow individuals to own means of production. But other than that, we have a tiny, non-coercive state and no taxes and practically no laws. And it works for us because we have a high level of consciousness. So it's also important for Earth humans to raise their level of consciousness. That said, that might be more of a medium-term solution, and if you don't do anything in the short term, then a few rich families might replace half of all jobs with AI and robots, leading to even more economic hardship for average people. And yes, it's entirely possible that mass arrests or a solar flash, etc., will happen soon. But it's still useful for Earth humans to be aware of how to build a society that is stable in the long term. Let's say you arrest the bad guys and everyone raises their level of consciousness. If you allow families to own means of production and also to snowball their wealth, then those families might still be both out of touch and overly powerful, which isn't ideal even if those families are well-meaning. I hope this was helpful. Also, this was the end of the political series. Certainly we'll talk more about politics somewhere in the future, but next week's message won't be political. With that, I wish you a very good week. I love you so very much. Your star sister, Tunia.